going to leave Bergen and go to the other side of the world very soon as our journey in 12 countries, 12 book festivals around the world is continuing.
And if you just joined us now, I mean, we are embarking on the biggest book festival in history, because there might be other festivals that are larger in area. We are in a small space right now, but no way has there been a book festival that lasts for 12 hours in 12 countries in 5 continents. So if you're longing to see ocean, palm trees, or on the other hand, snow, and to hear novelists, spoken word, you're in the right place.
Oh, yes. And we're going to a castle in Jaipur, India as well. And it's going to be poets on a beach in Jamaica.
So stay put, get a coffee, and we're going to the other side of the world soon.
This is such a unique opportunity to listen to other people's thoughts, what's important for them, the stories, and especially now in these times of isolation.
Yeah, and you can think of Mona and I as your literary air hostesses. And we can't tell you where the mask drops down or where the exit signs are. But we can guarantee you that you will think some new thoughts, you will have some new insights, you'll learn some new facts, and hopefully you'll find a new favorite author.
Yes. And from Bergen, here in Norway, we're going to a country on the other side of the world. It would actually be a 24-hour flight and many drinks before we come to Australia. What comes to mind if I say Australia?
Surfing, of course, novels like Thornbirds and A Town Like Alice, and the movie Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and koalas. They're so cute.
Yes, and what about kangaroos?
Kangaroos.
The movie Muriel's Wedding,
Yeah.
MasterChef Australia, Richard Flanagan, and of course many other authors.
So now we're going to Writing Western Australia, which is placed on historic ground in Perth.
Hello to all the people of the world as you stand upon your land out there. Barry I am Barry Maguire, standing here upon the Wajok lands of my people since the start of time. And as I stand here and through our language of old, I will bring you an understanding of the energy that exists here. And may the energies of my grandmother and grandfathers, my ancestors have gone before me, and your ancestors bring an understanding of the tongue that exists here since the start of time. You see, for us as Aboriginal people, we are a book of our ancestors. We have been writing into each other an understanding of our governance and our songs and our stories and our obligations of life, so that we understand the oneness of life in the pathways that we have forged through this land over thousands of years. And as a story of my father, he has told me that we are the books of him and our mother. You see, all the language that I give and the songs that we have come from my mum and dad. And I stand as a living book here today for you to understand also that you and your children, you write into them. Another form of existence of writing, another form of human existence in the strength of life. And so, from us as an Aboriginal people of the Wajok lands here today, within Perth, Western Australia. Ngalaka diman ga mamanga yera wutlujara ba nicha baranga jara ngalaka bulan jara ngupwa kian ba khatanga jara ba dalan jara ba dukuna jara. May the energies of that, of our ancestors, help us to stand as one within our minds, the things that we write, the things that we speak about, so that we can create a oneness of life into the future. Wanja ba nuno ka wutlujara ba kakawana jara ba kian ba yakana jara khatanga jara nuno ka yeye. Welcome to you all. It's an honor to stand as one within the mindset of life.
This is truly something special. And live in Perth, we are calling journalist, writer, and host Gillian O'Shaughnessy. Hi, how are you?
Hello, Mona. Hello, Siss. Very well, very excited to be here. And I just loved hearing the conversations and presentation from Bergen. Perth is a very different city.
Yeah, we're in ice-cold Bergen. Could you describe, not exactly where you sit now, but outside? What's the air like? What does it smell like?
Well, it's very warm here. We're in the middle of our summer, so very different indeed to Bergen. So we're speaking to you at the moment from the city centre in Perth, from our state library. So that's in the centre of the cultural district in Perth, in the city centre, and we're a very spread out city. We are fringed by skyscrapers and then the Swan River. And you saw beautiful Kings Park where Barry Maguire was speaking from early. That's one of the world's largest natural parks and it overlooks the entire city. It's a beautiful place. So we've just had a bit of much needed rain over the last few days, although it's warm again now, but it gives you the most gorgeous smell in the air. I think when the earth is really dry and it rains, you get just a gorgeous, almost metallic, earthy smell, and it's called petrichor. So we breathe that in. We love a bit of rain over here. And yeah, it's very flat, it's very spread out, it's very close to the Indian Ocean, so we see the sunset over the sea, which is a beautiful thing. And one of the things I really appreciated about Perth when I first travelled was we have such a high sky here. It gives you the most incredible sense of space. We spend a lot of time outdoors.
Gillian, this is the opposite of where we are. We are between 7 snow-capped mountains, and outside our venue there is actually a big snowman. So if you feel hot, we can send him over to cool you down.
Yeah, and we have a picture of you. Let's see, it's a photo. Should be a photo. Oh, who is this? It's you, but who's the other one?
Yes, I'm the one in the back with the mask on and the hat and the very handsome man in front of me. That's Hubie. He's my dog. He's a Labrador Collie Cross. He loves to swim. He's very old. He's got a bit of arthritis, but he still likes to plunge in the ocean and dig in the sand for his ball. So we've been going down the beach a bit. We were in lockdown for a few days just recently, so we were allowed an hour a day of exercise. We've been very lucky here in Western Australia in that for the most part during the pandemic we have not had to be in lockdown. We've had very few cases, but yes, just recently, so mask on and out at the sea. He's a beautiful boy.
The year 2020 has been difficult for everyone, but in Australia, the year started with raging wildfires and floods. And what role can literature play in such testing times?
Well, Australia is such a huge country, Siss, that in Perth, and we're often described as the most isolated city in the world, we are a lot closer to parts of Asia than we are to parts of our own country. So the worst of our natural disasters that you would have seen presented in media around the world were over on the East Coast at the beginning of 2020. That said, it just... in the last couple of weeks, we've had terrible bushfires just north of Perth, 86 houses were lost, and we've had some of the worst flooding up north in recent memory. The fires and the floods last year really connected the country, I think, both in terms of what we could see unfolding and the devastation, not just the cost in human terms, but the landscape and the wildlife. So I think when you're looking at a country that has such diverse landscape and such diverse people as well, literature plays a really important role in connecting us with our own stories and our history. And also, given our isolation from the rest of the world, it connects us with the human story as well. And personally, I found last year quite testing working in the media, as you know, just at times very relentless. And it was, I mean, it's a privilege to bring people information, but it also, I found it very draining. So I often would come home from work and just read for solace as well and escape. And I think that we can forget sometimes when we talk about the importance of literature, we can forget that side of it as well. It just is a wonderful window into other worlds that can provide an escape from the world that you're living in. And I really, I love to switch off in that way. We have wonderful writers that reflect so much of our story here in Australia because our colonial history is very young and our country's history is very old. Then being able to get a really broad perspective of all of those stories reflected in some of the wonderful writers we have. I think for a long time Australia looked to writers from other parts of the world. We're a little bit self-conscious about our own story, and I think that has changed immeasurably recently. We have some wonderful writers, including the writer you'll hear from in a moment.
Yes, we're so excited to meet one of Australia's most acclaimed authors, Kim Scott. I don't know if you will just introduce him to us and start your session. We're so excited.
I would love to. Now, before we start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we're speaking on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the country, the first storytellers, their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge that the land has never been ceded. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Kim Scott. He is a Noongar writer who grew up on the south coast of Western Australia. His novels include Benang from the Heart, That Dead Man Dance and Taboo. He's won Australia's most prestigious writing award twice, the Miles Franklin Literary Award. His work looks at issues of identity and race and the impact of colonisation. In August last year, Kim wrote an essay entitled One Voice for the anthology Fire, Flood and Plague in response to a very challenging year here in Australia and around the world. Beginning with those fires that ravaged our east coast and floods and a global pandemic. Please welcome Kim Scott. Hello.
Hello, Jill. And hello across the world there.
Kim, can I ask you, first of all, for our international audience particularly, to just talk a little bit about who the Noongar people are?
It was nice to start with Barry with that, with his welcome. He's a generous and soulful man, Barry Maguire, which I'd like to think are intrinsic qualities of Noongar people. However, it's also a traumatised community. So by Noongar people, Noongar country, we mean the southwest of WA, possibly the oldest continent on the planet that we're part of, and one of the oldest continuing cultures. So there's something like, there's hundreds of language groups across the continent that have been here in time immemorial. Noongar people, as I say, that's southwest of the continent, from a bit north of Perth to heading across to South Australia. 60,000 years by carbon dating, I think, we generally accept. And one of the things we have to acknowledge, I think, is that within 50 years of first colonisation, first contact, something like only 10% of the original Noongar population remain. And then we have an apartheid-like regime until pretty late after midway in the 20th century. And we're living at a time when it's moved from attempted destruction and denigration of that culture and that heritage to something like celebration in the enlightened members of our wider society. And a lot of that's compelled by issues to do with identity and belonging, I think, as a young settler nation, I think is the expression. I think, I'm sorry to get so grand straight away. I think, Australia is characterised by all sorts of anxiety itself about identity. I'm often characterised as someone, impoverished in terms of Noongar cultural heritage and trying to articulate a sense of identity, which may well be accurate. But I think Western Australia as a nation, as a state, Australia as a nation, is riven by issues of identity. What does it mean? And I think I write a lot about what does it mean to be living on this old continent, and what does it mean to me particularly, descendant of those, as Jared Diamond says in Guns, Germs and Steel, descendant of those who first created human society in this part of the planet, and a culture that's closely aligned to nature and an old natural environment. So I hope that was answering the question, who are the Noongar people? And Barry said, I think he said something about we are books
Living
for our
books.
people. He's a lovely man, Barry, and you heard from his language, he probably comes from, sad to say it, a stronger position than myself in terms of cultural heritage. But it's interesting to hear him talk like that. The idea, it aligns with me, the idea of being a good ancestor. And from where I'm coming from, I think a lot of my writing is trying to somehow summon up and create a world for myself and perhaps for other Noongar people that's adequate to an expression of that situation and that will position Noongar people and heritage at the heart of the nation. Again, that sounds grand, but I just start from possibly very private and self-obsessed concerns. I know. Do you want to stop me yet?
No, I don't want to stop you.
An early book of mine, before we get to the essay,
Yeah.
in line with this, one of my earliest novels that had a modicum of success came from coming into this building, the State Library, the State Archives, and trying to work out how come someone like me, I went to university, there was no Aboriginal literature, there was only just Australian history, so quite a colonial situation still in the 1970s. There was African literature they had there. And I went through those processes, so colonial Australian English literature I was educated into. And I became a school teacher, and I felt awkward and fraudulent because some of the other teachers, the manual arts teacher, as we called it then, could fix his car and build a house. Home economics teachers could put on a lovely feed for all of us. What could I do? Just talk about it. So I wanted, at that point, to work out what the business, not the business in a dollar sense, but how did you publish and write? Taking writing seriously, if I was telling young people about it. And as part of that process, I came in here to look at what was in the state archives that carry the language of our shared history. How did they speak to me? And it was quite a horrifying experience to see how people in local histories would talk about, try and strut about who was the first white man born in such and such a place, and also who was the last full-blood Aborigine. And I put that language in its acronyms, LIFBA and FUMAB, and they seem to express the ugliness of it. And it was even more shocking to see a whole book written by a man who was Chief Protector of Aborigines, so-called, for 3 or 4 decades. When he retired, he wrote a book called Australia's Coloured Minority, Its Place in the Community. In the acknowledgements of that novel, I wrote that down as their place in our community, which probably indicates how I felt I didn't belong in that book, how marginalised I didn't belong in the state archives, in fact. And that was a major impulse for trying to rewrite some of that work. There was a photo, 3 generations reading from right to left, and the last fella in that family photograph, I suppose, you couldn't tell in a stereotypical sense that he was Aboriginal. And that was the game plan, it seemed to me, of history there. Mm. There's no place in the Australian community at that point for Aboriginal people. That was the solution. So a lot of my writing, is to trying to fill that silence, particularly in a personal sense, and consequent to that, to discover that my family history includes Noongar people living in an area infamous in the histories for massacres in the late 19th century, and trying to be something other than angry and or disappearing, to try and articulate, as Barry was saying, what is the book you can hand on to family and the wider community? How can you speak for ancestors? Trying to do that in literature.
There was a really an ongoing and interesting project that you were working on at the start of 2020. But before we talk about that, could I just ask, in terms of the Noongar people, I think for our international audience, they would think of Aboriginal people and they would think of the same people, but there are in fact 300 nations within Australia of Aboriginal people. Could I just ask you to talk a little bit about that, and then we can perhaps talk about the project?
Yes, they're generally grouped together because certainly at the point of first contact, it's black people, but they're different. It's like sometimes I've superimposed an outline of Australia over, say, Europe, and you see different cultures, different nations. I think that's the case in Australia. Of course, for political reasons, there's also a sense of pan-Aboriginality, as there is pan-indigeneity, I guess, across the world, that shared experience of colonial oppression and of structural racism very much. So the job, it seems to me, in Australian literature, it would tend to favour that pan-Aboriginal approach. So it's part of the challenge writing is to write from one's own region, one's own nation, one of those hundreds of groups, but still speak to that wider colonial enterprise and try and rip it apart, deconstruct, if not rip apart.
Now, at the beginning of 2020, and we go now to your essay, One Voice, at the beginning of 2020, you're about to go to the south to continue working on a particular project that was quite important in terms of Noongar history. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and you might have to cut me off because I do start to carry on when I start talking about this. The project to which you're referring is about cultural recovery and consolidation. So it's independent of the so-called literary novels. Again, early on with the novels, I had, the one I've already mentioned, Benang, with some degree of success, I can remember having, without being too precious, some sort of crisis who am I writing for? And I think it's probably a lot of colonial writers or Indigenous writers in colonial frames have this issue. Noongar people being a minority of my audience. And I still think it's still useful, and I've had touching feedback that matters a lot to me from Noongar readers. But it also made me realise that I wanted, if I was any sort of literary person, I needed to be doing more than that. So the work, a lot of my so-called literary work has moved into trying to recover stories in our old language, our ancestral language, stories and songs, and inevitably, because they are so closely aligned with the continent itself, it moves into trying to rebuild community, that remnant community of survivors through a traumatic history, reunite them with language, story and song in as best as I can do as an individual, and with landscape. And that means I've had to rely upon, and I've been given, if it doesn't sound too grand, responsibilities and been gifted things from elders who've claimed me as an ignorant man in my young adulthood, not knowing ancestral country where it was or a sense of that Noongar community, who have wanted me to have claimed me and moved me into a subset of the Noongar community where there's trust and I think love. And so all I can do is try and use stories to build up that community. And that means, in that essay I was talking about some of these sort of projects where, in particular, we try and work with archival stuff that elders have given me and us, recordings and what they remember and site knowledge, and also archival stuff, and particularly some work from the 1930s, an archive in the International Phonetic Alphabet of Stories, an American linguist who went back to the States, and the paperwork didn't get back here till somewhere around the cusp of this century. And we, with the help of those elders to which I've referred, particularly Hazel Brown, with whom I did a non-fiction book, Kai Young and Me, we tracked down descendants of the informants, the people that spoke to that linguist. And we pulled together people that they wanted to find out about this paperwork. But this was beginning of this century. The very first time we got together, so this is a long-winded way to get to that essay, but I think I need to say this. The very first time we got together, 60 or 70 people, and we called the gathering and said we want to hand back some of this paperwork from our old people way back in 1930, and we named them and said, here's the children and the grandchildren of them. You're here because of these connections. Within 5 minutes of starting that, everybody in the room was crying. And I think that was a measure of our strong desire to reconnect and to listen to ancestors and rebuild ourselves as a community. So one of those bits of paperwork, Tortbalke, dog his head. It's a word for seal. I had the children of the informant with me when we was part of that group. And their dad, there's a brother and a sister, their dad had given this story to the linguist and it had gone away. He died when they were both very young. One was a toddler and one was still a babe in arms. They'd never heard these stories. They didn't know a lot of Noongar language. They knew other Aboriginal languages from growing up in missions and reserves. And it was, a great and rare privilege and pleasure as part of a group of people to get to a situation where they could reproduce their father's words with the help of the group of us, that story, and we toured schools and communities in the southwest, in the Great Southern, which is our Noongar country. And they, the daughter, Helen Hall, did the pictures. Russell Nelly, his father George Nelly, was the informant to the linguist, did the picture book. But even more than that, we were able, through a combination of the paperwork from 1930 and bringing community together and sharing memories of the informants and other stories, to begin the process of reconnecting that with landscape on the south coast. Now that matters, I think, in terms of place and identity and belonging. It also matters in terms of, if you think about the colonial place names along this area of the coast, Fitzgerald River National Park is the place I'm talking about. And the mountains, if we can call them that in that area, are referred to as the Barren Ranges. By Matthew Flinders gave them that name. Speaking of, there's nothing there. There's place names like Starvation Harbour, Mount Misery, Lake Disappointment. So they're about a certain sort of colonial experience. I've also referred to the area being infamous for massacres of Noongar people. It's also an area distinguished by its environmental destruction. And there's some wonderful work happening there with Gondwana Link trying to rehabilitate that area of country. So it's enormously risky and chancy, I think, to go into that area. And we have to go through the national park. It's 3 hours to get to these areas of landscape. We've Google Earthed them. We've had years of workshops, 40 or 50 people at the time invited by these two people, reconnecting with their dad's stories from all that time ago. And the song that connects with this story of dogs hunting, a man hunting with dogs. They frustrate him because they get the animals, and by the time he gets there, there's nothing left for him to eat. And so he goes down to the coast and he waits for them to go to sleep. And as they go to sleep, he lights a fire around them. And then we have a time lapse in the story, and the dogs are described as the wind is howling, the fire's leaping, they're held in the hands of fire, and they leap high through the flames and roll down into the sea. And then they're barking at this fellow that's done this, and they're singed and burnt. So they have at this point become seals. And we found that place, that ridge where they roll down into the sea, thanks to the notes and recovering oral history. And what I was trying to talk about was the business of wanting to keep that work happening, and the destruction to the natural environment had caused these bushfires, had many argue that imbalance had created this pandemic which had frustrated us going there. And in that context, I wanted to talk about a very intimate relationship with country, with the natural environment that we were reigniting, if you like. So I think with that essay I started with wanting to be there, wanting to reconnect and build community and connect with those so-called books of our heritage. And the first time I went in there with this group of 15 or so of us, Noongar men mainly, and we got to the beach. This is where the dogs rolled into the sea. And we walked around the beach, and it seemed like a welcome. It seemed contradictory and a paradox that at the end of this beach we're walking around, thinking, is this the place? And looking at the notes, it says there's a big rock representing the head. It says this is where it happened. At one end of this little crescent of sand, brilliant white sand that squeaks under your feet when you walk on it, very isolated, hours from the bitumen. There, a plastic fishing net had been wedged amongst the rocks, and the sand had formed around it. As we got close, we were wondering, what is this? As we got closer, we realised some birds had nested there, and we realised the birds were still there. And we walked up to them, and they were still there. They didn't go away. And it was not until we reached out, one of us, to touch them, that the birds ran away. They couldn't fly at this stage. And in a way of thinking, the intimacy of that little encounter was like a welcome, like what Barry was talking about there. And it meant in some ways that we were on the right track of doing that. And as I said early on, it's a 10% surviving. You know, there's language and story that is pure, and how it might be a catalyst for a reconnection with the heritage of that place, and how we might share it with that little rural community that's struggling there. So what I've talked of here, I hope, is that literary work extending into cultural recovery work to rebuild community and a sense of place and belonging and identity. And then how to share that with that wider community, which has historically been so very hostile to our continuity and our sense of self.
It's interesting, I think, in your essay you say it's tempting to think of, and it was so interesting talking about that story of fire, and it was the fires in 2020 that put a temporary halt to that. And you said it's tempting to think of the floods and fires as retribution, that these creation stories worldwide feature punishment of sinners, and that was a temptation, but it's not how you look at it.
Well, there is an element of that, but I think that story being about utilising fire within it in the context of climate change being a contributing factor and the loss of land management that our ancestors provided on this continent. They're very much behind that sort of thing. And in the story that I refer to, that fella uses fire, he controls fire. And there's a lot of work being done in the last couple of decades of coming to an understanding as a nation how this continent was shaped by fire. It's the only continent, so I'm told, in The Biggest Estate on Earth, a wonderful book by Bill Gammage, Australian author. Australia is the only continent where the biggest trees grow on the poorest soil. It's changed in 200 years, but that was the condition of things. And people could shape the landscape so they'd know where animals were going to be. The reason the trees grow on the poorest soil, the biggest trees, because other areas were periodically burnt, and often that would be so fresh shoots would grow there and attract animals. You'd know where to be there. And so you have these rhythms in the landscape, if you like, where the animals are going to be, where the burning is going to happen, the harvesting, and so on, all these natural rhythms that are contained within creation stories. And the idea of accessing them, which I've touched on with that earlier story, and what land management practices and what ways of being in the landscape that they indicate, I find very, very exciting. And I think, do you want to interrupt me with a question? I think the idea of reconnecting with that heritage, I mean, certainly from our community, the Willam and Noongar community, has a great healing dimension to it, because it offers you stories and ways of being that are very different to what you've received from colonial history. There's those elders I talked of reconnecting with their dad's stories, not knowing those stories, not knowing that language, but as Uncle Russell Nelly would say, all I knew was I was a black man. That means he knew the experience of racism and oppression. They're not stories that nurture you. These other stories are. They give you a different way of being, a different trajectory for your life. And I would add, if I'll keep going here, they also offer the possibilities of transformation. I don't mean that in a glib way. I'm thinking of one instance when we work with these stories where it was my idea, after the 50 or 60 of us had worked on putting these books together, Before we published them, we'd invite that wider circle of the Noongar community in this little country town down on the south coast of WA. We'd invite them along so we could gift them these stories and celebrate the work we'd done as a collective. My elders at the time, so nearly 20 years ago, wanted to invite a couple of members of so-called pioneering families. And I can remember arguing with them saying, no way in the world, we're not going to invite them. They stole our country. You worked like slaves on their property for all those years. They've got rich on our land. But they said, no, we've got to invite them. I said, no. Why? Why on earth? And they said, because so-and-so, he grew up with us and he speaks a bit of Noongar language as well. So at this gathering of maybe 100, 99% Noongar people, 98%, there's probably 2 non-Aboriginal people there. After we'd handed out these set of stories and a CD of some of us reading them aloud to key people in the different families and factions of a traumatised community still bringing itself together, we called out the name of one of these non-Aboriginal blokes who I didn't want to invite. So he walked out in front of all these Noongars and he received his gift and he said first up, "Wandonkabit." He said in Noongar language, "I'm a bit deaf, kadich, but I don't understand much Noongar language." But he said it in Noongar, which was very witty and respectful of him and proved what the elders had said. And then when he was returning to his chair, we got a photo of him, he's crying, tears are streaming down his cheeks. And it occurred to me there, this is the business of literature, in a way, this sort of literature. The paradox of empowerment through giving. We had gifted these stories from this little group, itself recovering and reconnecting with heritage. And that had, we were the powerful ones, and he was grateful that we had included him. And it seemed to me there's something of the storytelling situation in that we tapped into. And I was wrong. It was very right to it. But how to do that, I get a bit prickly with some of this stuff. Barry in his welcome was very generous, I think, being inclusive of people. But I'm stuck, and you'll forgive me for this, I'm stuck on this business of the destruction and attempted denigration of this culture. And now it's still part of the colonial enterprise, it seems to me, a little settler colony wanting to grab that stuff. But we've got to bring a damaged community along with it as well. And there's a strong hint, I think, in that little encounter. We give you these stories, but not everything at once. There has to be a relationship there.
Yeah. And I think we can agree that I don't want to interrupt you.
I know, I rave on.
And if I do, I'll interrupt
And I'm speaking to the world in a way, so forgive me.
When we run out of time. So I want to ask you about that because we talk about, we're the current crisis and there is the pandemic. The word unprecedented is used a lot, which I know you also, I think, quite reasonably get prickly about. There's fire and flood, but you also talk about the crisis of the quality of our leadership. Can I ask you to talk more to that?
I think that relates to the colonial enterprise. Yes, you're right about the pandemic. That 10% surviving, part of that's down to enormous destruction of the environment and diseases and smallpox. There's also straight-on violence in there. But the quality of our leadership relates to not wanting to recognise that fact. So the Aboriginal community across the nation talks a lot about, of late, the need for truth-telling and the need for an Aboriginal voice in our infrastructure of governance, a voice and a component of that infrastructure, which we have not got. Aboriginal people aren't recognised in Australia's constitution. When it was formed, we were counted amongst flora and fauna. It was a white Australia policy stopping immigrants coming in, people of colour, let alone the custodians of the continent. So our leadership does not want to recognise that. It's so, I would think it's so insecure in a way, psychologically insecure, that it can't deal with the business of prior occupation. I can remember the 1990s, early 1990s, when native title was recognised by the High Court of the land. That is prior ownership of the continent, and that's 1788, say, if we say it's Sydney. It's not until 1993 that that fact is recognised. That is, there's something psychologically really unhealthy about that. And I think that persists in our leadership. This, what do we call it, blown up bluster of the colonial leaders not wanting to face that sort of thing, to the extent that when we had what's called in Australia the Uluru Statement, a long process around the continent of those many different language groups and nations coming together for the sake of Australia to talk about what do we as Aboriginal people want to contribute to the nation, where do we want to be, and saying, well, we need a component of the infrastructure, we need a voice, we need to be represented. Our leader at the time lied and said, look, what they're wanting is a third chamber of government, and it was nothing like that. The whole shut that down is the same sort of hysteria we had around the time of native title. Insecurity, uncertainty and doubt were the words repeated as complaints at that time, and I think they persist. So this bluster that's around, not only, even when there's a pandemic, and bushfires, don't put it down to climate change. And they're saying it's just, we can manage this. That's the same shrill and brittle leadership. It's the bunyip aristocracy, as Don Watson said, and bullshit and bluster with the situation of our natural environment and with the situation of Aboriginal people being a part of our continent. And if we, so I have a strong feeling, I am, in some ways, I know to a number of people in the Aboriginal community, perhaps an apologist in a way, because I say we want to be part of Australia. I want to be part of Australia as a Noongar person, but I want to be somewhere near the centre of it. And the old stories that I have encountered in recent decades and what I see at first contact is Noongar people being very generous and inclusive and very culturally agile. First contact within one of my novels, That Dead Man Dance, tries to riff on this sort of business, where you see a guide, a Noongar guide leading an expedition from Albany, my hometown on the south coast, for a few days and coming back. And the diarist, the colonial diarist, talks about this guide, Narkina, how interested he was in my expedition journal and pressing flowers between the leaves. He kept asking me about this. And the same diarist reports when they got back to Albany, he sees his Noongar guide performing a recitation of their expedition to his people. And the diarist is adept enough to notice that that recitation is structured episodically, day by day, as is the expedition journal. So it incorporated some of those features of a new cultural product in his recitation. So that indicates to me a propensity to move into literature. And there's many other examples like that. Henry Lawson talks of one of Australia's literary idols, colonial Australia, talks of meeting a Noongar man in his kangaroo skin cloak who speaks fluent French because he spent 12 months on a French whaling ship. That ability, it's not a static primitive culture, it's ready to move into the future. And that's why that's one of the reasons, not only reasons of social justice, that we need Australia's Aboriginal heritage at the centre of our wider society, I would think.
There's when
I'm sorry to stop you there.
No, when you started thinking of the essay, there was a lot going on that was wider than the immediate problems of the pandemic in Australia, of the bushfires and the floods. And I'm just referring internationally to the death of George Floyd in America and his statement, "I can't breathe," which reflected for you and resonated with an ongoing and
Yeah.
devastating instance of Aboriginal deaths in custody still that we still haven't addressed. So, I mean, racism is such a huge issue. This is such an extreme.
Yeah, no, the very same words were used, I think it's 10 years or so ago, by an Aboriginal man dying, killed by the justice system, representatives of the justice system. That's an ongoing thing. It hasn't stopped, that whole colonial business. And the business, I can't breathe, that closing down your possibilities, closing down your life, closing down your space through that violence and that plea, I can't breathe. That's in many ways, that's such a component of our national narrative. Let the country breathe. Let the continent breathe. Let its representatives of a culture that is so closely aligned with that continent and its natural environments, let it breathe. That's in many ways why it resonated with me. And to feel that surge a little bit, it seemed to matter.
Through all of this, you have a very hopeful voice in this essay. What gives you that hope?
You've got to have hope, hey? I think it's, without getting too twee, I think it's my life experience. You know, my father was the only surviving child to a woman born in a town 30 years after the massacre that it's infamous for. I grew up thinking of myself as of Aboriginal descent, so the pan-Aboriginal thing. And that was, as my father said, maybe it's racist, that's the best part of you. But he was disconnected. And we'd moved back, I was born in the city here in Perth, we'd moved back to the South Coast out of his desire in the 60s, before he would be legally represented as a citizen of the nation, because he wanted to reconnect with place and his heritage and his sense of family and a sense of, again, without being racist, a sense of quality and love, that spiritual generosity. And the fact that I've been able to deconstruct some of the stories that are most readily available to us, the sense of history, and to begin in a frail and always threatened way to try and reconnect through story with the landscape, with this older heritage, and try and build another way of living here, try and work towards that. That gives me hope. I remember reading Native Welfare Files in the middle of the 20th century, around the time I was born, where that surveillance-based Aboriginal Affairs Department is talking about my family and saying, they're scattered across the nation, it seems. And that is, they would have been feeling smug and self-satisfied that that was the assimilation project succeeding. I'm hopeful that it didn't, and we can keep trying to rebuild.
Kim,
you're a very good
you.
Listener, Jill. Thank
well,
you.
you're a very good speaker, and that was just was very moving. Such a pleasure. It's been such a pleasure for Writing Western Australia and Perth to take part in this event. And I would love to thank you, Kim Scott, for being with us.
You're very sweet.
Yeah.
You're all very sweet.
Well, it's just been a wonderful revelation. I really encourage anyone listening to go and look at Kim's essay, which is available online, I think.
I think so.
one voice. It's beautiful and it's part of a wider conversation. Thank you, Mona and Siss.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kim.
Kim, Scott, this was such an interesting and wonderful conversation. And you know, we have this mission, Gillian and Scott, that we want a word from every country. And we asked if Kim Scott maybe could give us a word. Have you chosen one for us?
We heard some from Barry earlier on, who's very good with language. I would suggest the word kaya, kaya,
Kaya.
kaya,
What is,
kaya,
what?
which means both hello and yes, which in turn I think indicates something of that positive and hopeful approach that Noongar culture and heritage gives us. It's also a word that in the last decade I'd suggest is moving into West Australian vernacular. So it's a word that's quite often shared. So these processes of sharing have been taking place. Kaya.
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 Thank you so much for Kaya. And Siss, you're also the chat host, not only the
Not
air
only
hostess.
literary air hostess, but chat hostess as well.
Yeah, and we actually have a question that has been posted under the streaming.
Yeah, we have a few actually. The first one is, this is very interesting, but I have sadly never read any of Kim Scott's books. Where should I start? A practical question there.
You're not alone there. There's a lot of people in that situation. I think sometimes some of my early work, I might be working a little bit too hard, and I'm told it's difficult, but that's the context. I'd suggest, I think my most successful novel has been That Dead Man Dance, which has been published by Bloomsbury in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's an attempt to rewrite or give a different perspective on early contact history in my hometown, Albany.
And we have some more questions. Since we heard earlier on about the Sami people and their oppression, do you, Kim Scott, see any similarities in the literature of other indigenous peoples?
I'm not well versed in global indigenous literature, but each time I do encounter, it's probably mostly in the United States, I've read this stuff. Yes, 100%. That we want to breathe. Let us breathe is one part of it. And that psychotic and brittle desire to crush as part of conquest, and the arrogance and the hierarchies of power, often constructed around race and a false sense of superiority that are established as part of the colonial project. I say that brittleness and that psychological insecurity because I'm aware in my own ancestral country, reading as I have closely the colonial documents, you see some of those diarists having their worldview shaken up at the deep humanity and generosity of people. On rare occasions they call their hosts and recognise in one journal, at least that I'm aware of, these are our landlords. And they realise momentarily, because they cannot hold that mental position, the quality of these people they're encountering.
Thank you so much, Kim Scott. We have another question, but it's very big. So I don't want to pose it to you because then we would need 5 more minutes. So I think we'll just have to say thank you to you both in Australia. I mean, we'll obviously go back and see this transmission again, which will be available for 10 days. And everyone out there who has seen this, please tell your friends so they also can discover Kim Scott and his literary universe and talk about cultural repair, which I just I just feel that's lovely for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gillian and Kim. This has been amazing, and it was so great to hear you and get out in the world. And actually, we're